This is the Rich Dad Radio Show. The good news and bad news about money. Here's Robert Kiyosaki.
Hello, hello, hello. It's Robert Kiyoaski, the Rich Dad Radio Show. The good news and bad news about money. Today the subject is, are we on the eve of destruction? You know, as you know, years and years ago, I think 2002, I predicted that in 2016 the whole market would collapse. Now, I was guessing out there. I was based upon some facts, but it looks like it might come true. So the question is, are we on the eve of destruction? And more importantly, what does it mean to you and me? And what can you do about it? You see, the whole thing about this is you can actually get richer quicker when markets collapse. So that's actually good news and bad news. Now, it's bad news for those who are saying, oh, the economy is really good. I was watching CNBC, and they're saying this is it. We're going very well. The economy has come back, yada, 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 yada. So today we're going to listen to the other side of the story. And it's a dear friend, Richard Duncan. He's been our friend for years. He's the author of the book, The Dollar Crisis. The reason I love Richard Duncan so much is because, number one, he is a classically trained economist. I'm not. But also the definition of intelligence is, if you agree with me, you're intelligent. And Richard agrees with me. So, because what Richard and I agree upon is the problem in the economy, much of it is due to the U.S. dollar. And since there's no financial education in school, most people do not know how the dollar, which is really not money, it's a fiat currency, which means it can be printed at will, how it affects you and me. So the other thing I love about Richard is an American, classically trained at Vanderbilt and Babson College. I mean, he's a very smart guy, young guy. But the difference is he now lives in Thailand. So he sits outside of America looking in. And you know, unfortunately, what's really tragic about most Americans is most Americans have no idea what's going on 2 blocks from them. All they care about is, you know, what's the price of a Starbucks coffee today? Or what's the price of a loaf of bread at the supermarket? And for most Americans, that's their world. Or you know, what the price is at Disneyland next week. You know, that's about where they are. So the Richard Duncan, being an American, classically trained economist, worked for the IMF as well as the World Bank, has a view in America that very few Americans have, because most Americans have their eyeballs shut and ears closed, or they're being pummeled by bad information from our media system. So Richard is always somebody I enjoy talking to because he always disturbs me. But more importantly, he makes me redirect some of my thoughts and my actions. Kim, what do you think about Richard?
Well, Richard, of course, is one of our favorite economists of all time, and he does have a different take. And this is what I love is, you know, in America, we've got the news, and the news is, in my opinion, quite censored and quite biased, depending on which station you listen to. But Richard does have an international point of view, and we're going to talk about a lot of subjects today and hear a different point of view than what most of us hear in the media, and really a hands-on. I mean, Richard's got his finger on the pulse of the international economy, so he can see what's going on in the U.S. in relation to all the other countries. So I'm excited to hear the latest and greatest from Mr. Duncan.
So, Richard, are we on the eve of destruction?
Robert, Kim, thank you very much for having me on the program.
Oh, thank you.
Great to talk with you guys again.
And you're in Kentucky right now, not in Thailand. Is that correct?
That's right. I'm back home visiting my family this week.
Good for you. So as an American living overseas, looking back into America, you know, is America the new Greece?
Well, I think the starting point for everyone to keep in mind is that because the United States stopped backing dollars with gold back in 1968 or 1971, this allowed an enormous global economic bubble to form. Not just in the U.S., but the whole world was blown into an economic bubble. And in 2008, that bubble almost popped, and we almost spiraled into a new Great Depression. But the governments around the world, led by the U.S., with massive budget deficits and massive paper money creation, they've managed to keep this global bubble inflated. They didn't allow it to implode. So the starting point is to understand that we do have a very big global economic bubble, and it's very fragile. And if it's not handled with care, it could implode into a new Great Depression.
So that's good news for people like me who actually profit from depressions, right? And therapists.
Well, if probably wouldn't be good news for me, because if the U.S. goes into a depression, China is going to go into something very much worse. And
Right.
the starving Chinese would probably go south into the Thai rice fields and eat all the rice and put me in jail. So,
Put you in jail for
It would
being a
be-
foreigner living in Thailand?
well, you know what happened when after the Great Depression, Japan took over Asia, and everybody they caught there ended up in prison.
Oh.
Yep.
So, I would try to get back to Kentucky as quickly as possible.
And let me just ask, because Robert, you said, is the U.S. on the same verge as Greece? What's happening in Greece today? I hear nobody's trusting the banks.
The question is to Richard, are we doing the same thing Greece did?
And what is Greece doing?
Well, so for a long time, Greece spent far too much money relative to its income, and now it can't pay the money back.
Well, is that
That's
the
basic
U.S.?
problem.
Is that the U.S.?
The U.S. is doing the same thing, but because the U.S. is so much larger than Greece, we haven't come anywhere near the level of debt to GDP that Greece has.
But the other
So we
part
can
too
keep
is
doing this for a while.
But isn't this part of the reason you wrote Dollar Crisis back in 2003? The U.S. can print money and Greece cannot.
That's right. The dollar crisis, the theme there was that the U.S. trade deficit was becoming so large that it was throwing off dollars into the global economy and blowing all the trade surplus countries into bubbles. And those countries were taking the dollars they accumulating and put them back into the U.S. property market and blew the U.S. property market into a bubble.
And the stock
So that
markets.
and the stock market. And so that all blew up in 2008, and we've been on government life support ever since.
So are we?
But-
And answer the question again. Other than the fact that Greece cannot print money and the U.S. can print money, is U.S. doing the same thing Greece has done?
Well, it is, but because the U.S. economy, the size of the economy is about $17 trillion, and the government debt is about $17 trillion. So we've got 100% government debt to GDP. I'm not exactly sure what Greece is, but it's far higher. Japan is 250% government debt to GDP.
That means they
So the
spend.
U.S. could keep running up debt for a long time before it hits these sort of levels and blows up.
Yeah, what that means for the average person, Richard, because most people didn't go. I'm not economists, thank God they're not. But anyway, what you're saying is that most people are like Greece. They spend more than they earn, and they borrow when they spend. Is that what's going on?
That's the way it works in America now. People are encouraged to borrow and spend as every last dime they can get their hands on.
Right, and that's
what they tend to do.
So I should say it this way: that most Americans are like Greece, then.
That's true. The Americans are much more like Greece than the United States is like Greece.
Right, because most Americans can't print money because they're not capitalists, and a capitalist knows how to print money. So that's the very big difference. Once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show. We're talking to a great friend, very brilliant guy. He's an author, economist, worked for the IMF as well as the World Bank, and most importantly, he's an American who lives outside of America and looks in at America. So he's not blasted by the news the way we are, which is basically censorship. And Richard Duncan is the author of The Dollar Crisis, which came out in 2003. I'd recommend everybody read it, except most people couldn't read it. It's a pretty tough book, but it's a great book if you're interested in what's causing this crisis. And it's really not the economy, it's the money. It's like we've messed up the gasoline in the economy, our money. So that's what we're talking today. And as long as we keep printing money and pumping it into our system, everything looks good today. So the question I asked Richard, being an American living outside of America in Thailand, are we on the eve of destruction?
So, Richard, let me ask you this. I saw a headline just today, and it said that the government owns 60% of all U.S. home mortgages. That's pretty shocking to me, because the government was not in lending many years ago, and now they own 60% of all U.S. mortgages. What does that mean to me?
It's communism.
Well, yeah, I think this is a very interesting topic. This has happened through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored enterprises. Now the government-owned enterprises, because they went bankrupt in 2008.
And Franklin Raines made an awful lot of money. Very smart guy, you know. I mean, so
between 1987 and 2007, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac borrowed $7 trillion and bought up $7 trillion worth of mortgages, and that's what pushed up the property prices in the U.S. and created this property bubble.
So everybody thought their homes were worth a whole lot of money.
And people were able to extract a lot of money from their homes and spend it. And
they extracted via home mortgage loans.
So they upped their debt and they spent.
So they could continue improving their standard of living, even though that their jobs were being offshored to China and their wages were dropping. And so you have to wonder, was this a government policy to push up home prices to lessen the pain of globalization and deindustrialization for the Americans, or was it just massive bureaucratic stupidity?
That's a good question.
Actually, maybe some of both, but I really think it was probably a policy to lessen the pain of deindustrialization.
Yeah, what Mr. Duncan is saying is it's like they give you a credit card so you feel rich, but you're actually going broke, which is what Greece did. Am I correct?
Right. Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Well, how can I be broke? I still have a credit card. You know?
So if the government owns all these mortgages and they determine what the interest rates go up or go down, all of a sudden, if my house is now being propped up and I see all this false value in my home,
appreciation they call it,
are people going to start borrowing money out of their house again and doing the same thing?
Yes, I think that's already happening. The home prices now have been going up for a number of years. They're not as high as they were back in 2008, but a lot of people have seen a lot of home price appreciation, and so the equity extraction, the borrowing against their home, treating their home like an ATM machine.
Again, even though wages haven't gone up in unemployment's gone up.
Well, unemployment hasn't gone up. It's just underemployment has gone up. I mean, people have jobs, but they're not earning the big bucks they used to earn. So what they do is they go deeper in debt, then they borrow more money, and they go back to school, hoping going to school will pull them out of their morass that they're in. Once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show. We're talking to economist and friend Richard Duncan. He's a graduate of Vanderbilt as well as Babson College. He's worked for the IMF and the World Bank. And today he's an American living in Thailand, looking back in at America. And as we said at the start of the show, one of the problems I have with America is most Americans is they can't see past the corner. You know, is Starbucks open so I can get a cup of coffee so I can feel good and, you know, read my emails? That's where 99%, well, not 99, so probably 85% of the Americans are today. They're sucking on their latte and, you know, believing everything they read in the news that the economy is okay. So when we come back, we'll be talking to Richard Duncan once again. We'll find out, are we on the eve of destruction?
The Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
Today's show is brought to you by Casper. Get $50 towards any mattress purchase by visiting casper.com/richdad and using the promo code RICHDAD. Guys, these mattresses aren't just engineered, they're obsessively engineered at a shockingly fair price. Just the right sink, just the right bounce. How do they do this? They combine latex foam technology and memory foam technology for better nights and brighter days. That's double the foam technology of typical mattresses. You get a risk-free trial, sleep on your Casper for 100 days with free delivery and painless returns. Another bonus, Caspers are made in America, not one of those lame countries. You can get a Casper mattress for as little as $500 for a twin or $950 for a king-sized mattress. You cannot beat that price. Just go to casper.com/richdad and use the code RICHDAD to get an additional $50 off your purchase. Casper mattresses. Better sleep for brighter days.
Welcome to Capital City, from the mind of Robert Kiyosaki. Capital City, we've got everything. Dog groomers, candy stores, game shops, and you can own it all. Break away from the evil supercore by buying up businesses and properties that put big old piles of cash in your pockets. Choose from 11 crazy vehicles. Explore the streets of Capital City and build the empire of your dreams. You can play Capital City with up to 5 friends, or take on the evil supercore robots. Capital City, now available on the App Store and Google Play. Capital City, it's not just fun, it's crazy fun.
It pays to listen. Now, back to the Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the good news and bad news about money. Once again, you can listen to this program on your time and your schedule. We have a Rich Dad Radio app, and that app is available at the App Store. Once again, it's Rich Dad Radio app. And also, all of our programs are archived. The reason we archive them is because repetition is how we learn. For example, you want to be a great golfer, you don't just take one lesson and play the Masters. Repetition, repetition, repetition. So the reason we archive our programs at richdadradio.com is so you can listen to this program again. And I would suggest this program again, especially for those of you who want to see the future, because the question I'm asking our guest today, Richard Duncan, who is an American classically trained economist, worked for the IMF and the World Bank, but he lives in Thailand, and he looks into the bubble economy of America, and he sees the world bubble economy. You want to listen to this program again just because you want to be prepared for what's coming. So the question I've asked Richard, because he's been saying this for years, especially in his book, The Dollar Crisis, The New Depression, The Corruption of Capitalism, is that we're on the eve of destruction, because throughout history, anytime any government from the Romans have printed money, the economy collapses. Is that correct, Richard?
Yes. Sometimes these things
take longer.
Take a long time, but yes, it causes all kinds of distortion. And right now, this bubble came very close to imploding, and it's only because the government continues to intervene with very large budget deficits and this paper money creation by the Fed that this bubble hasn't imploded. So the government is managing the economy, and if it stops managing the economy or mismanages it, then there's a real danger. We are on the brink of destruction, and it would collapse.
So what do you see as the future? If we keep going down this road, are we going to have to go back to printing money? They stopped printing money, and the thing didn't collapse. What do you see is going to happen with this whole scenario?
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting. Back in 2013, when the Fed printed $1 trillion that year, the stock market went up 30%, and everyone felt richer and they spent more money, or at least the people with stocks. The next year, they printed only $450 billion, and the stock market went up 11%. But that still generated a lot of cash flow for a lot of rich people. Since October, they stopped printing money, and the stock market hasn't moved higher at all since then. And that's creating very significant headwinds for the economy now. In the first quarter, the U.S. economy contracted. And so I think we're potentially on a tipping point and at risk of really moving into a period of very significant turbulence in the stock market and the economy. If the Fed really carries through with its threats to move interest rates up over the next 12 months, then that's very likely to cause property prices to start going down, stock prices to start going down, and since they've been the main prop for economic growth in the country for the last several years, then the economy is likely to move back toward recession.
Well, I invest a lot in real estate, and what I see is a birds of prey, or the birds of death, like the buzzards of the economy, are now all over the skyline of the world. The birds of prey are the building cranes putting up large buildings like China did, with nobody to move in. In downtown Honolulu, I think I counted 11 cranes, birds of prey, sitting in the sky. And everybody's counting on the Chinese, who are going to run to town, and the Koreans to flood Honolulu and Waikiki, running from their governments. So anytime I see the birds of prey, the building cranes, I get a little spooked. What do you think?
Yes, that's always a great sign that there's a bubble forming. Really, I got my education in bubblenomics when I was living in Thailand from 1990 until 96.
The Thai baht crisis.
Hundreds of cranes, if not thousands of cranes on the horizon, and it was clear no one had enough money to move into all of those buildings. So that's always a sign that trouble's ahead.
And Richard, get this, I was talking to my friends who live in Honolulu, and they said it's so bad there now that even to put a down payment before the building is built, you got to put 300,000 U.S., not baht or yen, 300,000 U.S. just to stand in line. And the moment they accept your offer, it's another $300,000. That is a lot of cash, don't you think?
That's a lot of cash.
And you tie it up for 2.5 years. What's that?
I bet a lot of that cash is coming from China. People have made, a lot of Chinese have made so much money, they're desperate to get out of the country before they get arrested.
Yes, those government employees, same as the U.S. here. Anyway, and then also the Koreans. And I think Koreans legitimately have a lot of money, but they're afraid of that other guy north of their border.
Remember what happened in the 80s with the Japanese buying up all of the real estate all over the U.S.? We know how that ended. Japan's bubble popped, and they had to sell at a big loss, and that's likely to happen to the Chinese as well, because China has the greatest economic bubble in history.
Yeah, and once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki of the Rich Dad Radio Show. We're talking to Richard Duncan. He's a dear friend, and he's an economist trained at Babson and Vanderbilt. Also worked with the IMF and the World Bank, but more importantly today, he lives outside the U.S. He's looking inside the U.S., and he's the author of The Dollar Crisis, The New Depression, The Corruption of Capitalism. I want to let you know this is actually good news. So if those of you listening in, before you slit your wrist and go on suicide watch and slit your wrist, understand that these are the times that you pray for. When stupidity reigns is when you get rich. Is that true, Kim?
Absolutely. And here's a point I want to bring up, Richard, because you live in Thailand and now you're visiting Kentucky, visiting your family in Kentucky. So you're watching the media, you're looking at the newspapers. What do you see? Because you see what's really going on in the world. What do you see with the media? Because so many people here in the U.S. depend upon their information from the media, TV, newspapers. What do you see going on?
When I come back to the U.S. once or twice a year, I'm always struck by the television. It is so disturbing to me watching TV here that the news seems designed to keep the Americans perpetually terrified that they're about to be attacked.
Yes.
And then the news stops and you have an equally long commercial that terrifies them that they have some sort of disease.
Exactly. Exactly.
Or no, erectile
Yes.
dysfunction. Erectile
Of course, the
dysfunction.
government will pay for it.
Yes.
But if they take
so
the medicine, it
fear-based.
has all these side effects that are likely to kill them anyway.
Yeah, and they even say that. This may kill you.
Or even worse things than that. And so it's just terrifying to watch the television. It's like complete mind control to keep the Americans afraid and to keep them buying things.
Yeah, and my other friend who's an American like you who lives in another country undisclosed, he says every time he comes back into America now, it feels more like a Gestapo state. You have to go through all of these guys in blue uniforms, you know. I know it's not much different in many other parts of the world, but it's really, we're really getting a little tight here, in my opinion.
Is the news different in other parts of the world?
Yes, it's very different in other parts of the world. It varies from country to country, but it is different.
Not as much fear-based, not as much brainwashing, I guess would be the best word.
I think that's right. Generally, there's much broader coverage of what's really going on in the world and how it can affect everyone.
Let me ask you, do you think Americans are well-informed?
No, generally speaking, I think they're misinformed. They're fed so much nonsense.
Right.
That they don't have time to think about the really things that matter.
Right.
Like, is it a good idea for all of the factory jobs to move overseas? Now, that's an important question that the Americans should be discussing. Is that something that's ever discussed on television, on prime time?
No.
Not really. The labor unions are all gone now, and so there's no way for the working class people and middle class people to organize themselves the way they did back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And consequently, their standard of living is dropping like a rock. You never hear any of that on the television.
No.
So where do we get information? And I'm going to give one plug because you, Richard, have a newsletter called Macro Watch, which gives up to date of what you're seeing, what you're studying, what
all
you're
over
researching
the world.
Throughout the world.
Right.
So Macro Watch is the newsletter, and we recommend it. Not endorsing it, but we do recommend it because it's a great wealth of information. Where else do we get our information from today if it's not the media?
Well, I think it's important for people to read serious books, history books. If you want to understand where we're going, where we are, and where we're likely to go over the next 10 years, you need to understand where we're coming from over the last 100 or 50 years to see how we got here, see the momentum behind us. In order to understand the future, you need to understand the past and how we got to the present. And if you do, then you'll have a very much better chance of understanding really what's happening in the world and how that's going to impact you.
Well, the reason I love what you say, because it's not really the stock market, it's really the dollar crisis. And I don't think most people understand what that means. So let me give you some numbers here for those of you listening. And this is in my latest book, A Second Chance, which backs up what Richard is saying. In 1975, 40 years ago, if I had $1 million, I could put it in a bank, and the bank would give me 15% interest. That was in 1975. Today, 40 years later, 2015, I have $1 million. I put it in the bank, and I'm lucky if I get 2%. So the net effect here is this. In 1975, at a 15% interest, I earned $150,000 a year. And in 1975, $150,000 was real money.
You could live off $150,000 pretty nicely.
Today, when you put $1 million in the bank, and if you get 2%, you'll get 20%. I mean, $20,000, which is, if you try and live on your interest, on your $1 million, you're now living at $20,000. You're technically below the poverty line. And still yet, people say, save money. So the reason I encourage you to, subscribe to Richard's newsletter called macrowatch.com is because you really do need news. Savers are losers. These people are saving money and they're putting money in the stock market, and it's all propped up with this false dollar. Would you agree with that, Richard?
Yes, I think it is being propped up by enormous amounts of paper money creation over the Fed's printed more than $4 trillion since 2008.
That we know of.
Pumped it into the financial markets.
That we know of.
Prices.
So once again, this is Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. Right now, we're presenting to you the bad news. I want to let you know it's also good news. It's because the good news is they're not doing anything different they did before 2007, 2008. They're doing the same thing that caused the crisis. The only difference is who owns Fannie and Freddie. But other than that, this is a great time because I'm preparing right now to make more money than ever before. But you cannot do it by investing for the long term in the stock market and saving money. So when we come back, we're going to discuss oil, ISIS, Putin, and China's takeover of some islands in the Pacific.
That involve a high degree of risk. Oil and natural gas wells are naturally depleting assets. Cash flows and returns may vary and are not guaranteed. Past performance is no indication of future performance. Nothing herein shall be construed as tax or accounting advice. This is the Rich Dad Radio Show. The good news and bad news about money. Here's Robert Kiyosaki.
Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. Today the question is, are we on the eve of destruction? And our special guest today is dear friend, very smart guy. He's a classically trained economist from Vanderbilt as well as Babson. It means he really knows his stuff. He's the author of The Dollar Crisis, which came out in 2003. And the reason the dollar crisis is so important is because when you look at the economy, the problem with the economy, not the only thing, but the underpinning is the U.S. dollar. And so when I read The Dollar Crisis back in 2003, Richard Duncan, I said, this guy understands what he's talking about because it's not the stock market, it's not jobs, it's the dollar. He's also the author of The New Depression, The Breakdown of the Paper Money Economy, great book. And the book I love the most is called The Corruption of Capitalism, because we're no longer a capitalist state. You see, when Kim earlier said that Fannie and Freddie are now owned by the U.S. government, that's communism. You see, when the government controls our economic activity, that is the classical definition of communism. So it doesn't make a difference who wins this next election. Communism has won. So that's why Richard is our very, very special dear friend and guest. If you want to learn more from what Richard has to say, his newsletter is called macrowatch.com. And if you mention Rich Dad, you'll have a discount from it. But if you want to pay attention to what the world is, what's going on in the world, like Greece, like China, like Russia, like Europe, you've got to look at the world. And the problem with most Americans, like I said, they can't see the past. They can't see past Starbucks on the corner. And there may be 6 Starbucks on the same corner today. So really, it's really time to pay attention. And the reason it's called good news and bad news is because when this baby goes down, it's going to be the best time for people who are prepared for it. And that's why Richard is a very important man to listen to.
So, Richard, let's talk about oil for a minute, because, Robert, as you say, most people can't see past Starbucks. All they can see is what the price of oil is in their gas tank. So the world of oil has been doing some crazy things. Where do you see it going?
That's a very good question, because I honestly believe that oil prices, and this is, of course, just my personal opinion, but I believe that oil prices are manipulated through the derivatives market.
Really?
In total, there are $700 trillion of derivatives contracts in existence. That's the equivalent of $100,000 per person on Earth.
I just heard another number, Richard, is 1.2 quadrillion, and that's in my new book, Second Chance.
And these things trade over the counter with practically no regulation and no oversight and no transparency.
The average person doesn't know what a derivative is.
Contracts designed to be able to allow people to manipulate the price of oil. I think that's a good definition.
Yeah, but about 5 or 6 years ago, you got into a big fight with my oil friends from Texas because you predicted oil would be $7 a barrel, or you won't even. You said to them, our great friends at Reef Oil from Dallas, you said to them, you won't even remember the smell of exhaust. And now this guy Elon, there was there was about 300 people in this conference we had. Here's Richard on one side, and here's my oil friends from Dallas on the other side, and there was nearly a fist fight on the stage because what Richard
you were
was
egging me on, Robert.
Let's tell the truth there.
and it was so much. The audience just loved it. The audience loved it because I said there's always good news and bad news. There's always more than two sides to a coin. You got to listen to both sides. So naturally, the oil guys are predicting $200 a barrel, and you're predicting $7 a barrel. And as individuals, we need to listen to both sides. And now with this guy Elon Musk with his new battery power, he's really not a car dealer. He's really a battery guy. And this battery guys, if he puts in batteries with solar panels on top of your roof, we don't need the electrical companies. Almost, they'll be hemorrhaging also. Is that correct, Richard?
That's right. I think I told the audience back then that your grandchildren will never know what gasoline smelled like.
You really won the hearts of those guys from Texas, our dear friends from Texas. And now, unfortunately, I love Texas. I love KRLD, our station out there. And the problem is a lot of guys are being unemployed because you were right in your prediction.
Yeah, and that was even before this shale oil revolution that's resulted in the U.S. now overtaking Saudi Arabia as the largest producer of petroleum in the world.
So what you're saying is oil is obsolete, right?
Well, that's right. I mean, there's such a technological revolution going on. Within 30 years, I really think that you won't be able to give this stuff away.
So don't say that, man. I need my time. So I invest in oil for tax breaks.
We got another 10 years. We're okay.
I know.
We're okay.
But the thing I'm concerned about here is that all these people lose their jobs. But the good news about it is
new jobs will be created.
Invest in Tesla.
Yeah.
This guy Musk is a very smart boy. If I was a gambling man, I'd invest in the stock market and I would buy Tesla. But I'm not a gambling man because I'm a control freak. I'm an entrepreneur and I don't like gambling. So anyway, what Richard predicted that about oil, and as I said on the radio before, I invest in oil because I get tax breaks. If I invest $1 million in oil, I get $800,000 back. I don't really care about the price of oil. I want the tax breaks, the same as Elon Musk wants tax breaks. So what do you think about Mr. Putin?
I'm certainly not the world's great expert on Russia, but one thing is clear. Their economy is suffering. They're in recession.
Well, that's oil. Isn't that oil? Isn't that oil also?
That's oil, and even Brazil is in recession because the commodity prices have all fallen so much, and that's because China's economy is so weak. China's imports are dropping every month at a double-digit rate this year.
But
China's buying much less because their bubble is beginning to implode.
Right, but
this has repercussions all around the world.
Right, but then in 2014, China and Russia signed this pact to ship oil together, but also, again, the reason you are so important to us is when you talk about the dollar crisis, one of the reasons China and Russia signed that deal because they don't want to deal in the dollar because oil is dealt in dollars. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes, that's right.
So it's all about the money.
And is that when Putin became this evil man to the U.S.?
Well, I think this conflict between the United States and Russia or the Soviet Union has started at the time that Russia became the Soviet Union. And the United States is very happy to be able to increase its influence across Europe as far as possible. And now it's right up to the border of Russia itself.
Well,
they've taken in Poland and all of the former Soviet satellites. And the Ukraine is just the last one that they're beginning to pull into their orbit.
Okay, and then we have the G8 is now G7, means they kicked out Russia. Again, because China and Russia want to deal outside the dollar. And then, China is now in recession or going to recession. What's going to happen with there?
But the final word on Russia and oil, I don't think that it's just a coincidence that oil prices fell so much when the United States started having this conflict with Russia over the Ukraine. By allowing or pushing down oil prices, the United States, that's one way that the U.S. can punish Russia.
Yeah.
And Saudi Arabia doesn't like Russia either, though. Is that correct?
I think that's correct, yes.
Yeah, we have a good friend of ours, and he does a lot of business in Russia, and he sets up these fast food restaurants in Russia. And I talked to him last month, and I said, how's it going? He goes, well, my income's down 50% because the ruble is down 50%.
Once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show. We're talking about how the world affects the U.S. and how most Americans have no idea what's going on in the world. I mean, 99%, I would say. So you who are listening to the Rich Dad Radio Show are very, very smart, because when the S hits the fan, you'll be better off because of it. Our guest today is Richard Duncan. He's an economist. He's the author of the book, The Dollar Crisis, The New Depression, The Corruption of Capitalism. And if you want to stay tuned with what Richard is saying on a regular basis, his newsletter is called macrowatch.com, and you can get a discount mentioning Rich Dad. The last question I have is really about the last two questions, because it's all related. This is my point.
It's all related.
You know, you have China right now, and you have these islands that they're going to build on the South Seas and all this. But, you know, when you live as an American living in Thailand, see, China's already won. This is my point of view. China's already won Asia. Everywhere you go in Asia, there's Chinese, including Australia and New Zealand. They're already there. You know, they don't need to invade. The Chinese are already occupied Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia,
New York
all that
City.
Stuff. Yeah. And Sydney, Australia. I mean, the Chinese have won the invasion, right, Richard?
Well, of course, there are a lot of Chinese in the world, and it's amazing how rapidly their economy has transformed over the last 25 years. But the thing is, they're vulnerable because China's economy is entirely dependent on exporting to the United States. China's trade surplus with the U.S. last year was about $340 billion. And take that away, and China's economy implodes.
What does that mean to the U.S., though? I mean, I'm sitting in America. I'm sitting having my latte and Frappuccino from Starbucks, and you say, well, it's $340 billion. Well, so what? How does it affect America, Americans?
Well, in two ways. In one way, it means that the job that the American might have had in a factory doesn't exist. So all the factory jobs have disappeared for that reason, because they've moved to low-wage China. But at the same time, China takes this $340 billion that it accumulates, and it pumps it back into buying U.S. Treasury bonds. And that pushes up the bond price and pushes down interest rates. The lower interest rates make the home prices go up and make the stock prices go up.
Right. So this deal they cut with Russia, China, Russia, the oil, and China's going to now ship that oil to Southeast Asia and all that. Doesn't that mean to Americans that they may not want to buy our bonds anymore?
Well, I think they're just, in a sense, bluffing, or just beginning what could be a very long process. They really like the current arrangement that I call the dollar standard. They don't want to move back to a gold standard or an SDR standard or a Chinese currency standard, because they really need the United States to be able to buy things from them and to pay for them. So and if we went back to a gold standard, after about 3 months, the U.S. would completely run out of gold, and it wouldn't be able to buy anything else from China. China's economy would collapse.
Isn't China?
So this is good news for Wall. This is good news for Walmart shoppers, is what you're saying, right?
That's why there's no inflation in the country to speak of. In fact, there's a danger of deflation, because everything is now made with people who are only paid $10 a day at the most.
So when you talk about gold, too, I've also heard that China is accumulating a lot of gold. Is that correct? And why would they do that?
They are accumulating a lot of gold.
And why
why
would they do that?
I think because they feel that it's a much better idea than accumulating U.S. dollars or U.S. Treasury bonds.
Okay, the last question, because this is what people are really concerned about. How does this U.S. economy, the cheap dollar, or should I say the counterfeit dollar, affect ISIS?
ISIS, and again, I think economists should stick to what they know and not talk about every subject in the world. But, I mean, just my personal opinion about ISIS is my mother is afraid that ISIS is going to come to Kentucky and chop her head off because she watches it on television every night.
Yes.
But in my opinion, the United States was able to defeat simultaneously Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. and then later the Soviet Union, I don't think we're going to be brought down by ISIS.
You got to be kidding me, Richard. I mean, the difference between Japan and Germany was they were industrialized nations, and ISIS are a bunch of, latter-day
renegades.
Viet Cong, and we couldn't beat the Viet Cong. You remember that? Because I was out there, fighting the Viet Cong. We couldn't bomb them into the Stone Ages, as McNamara said, because there's nothing to bomb. That's the problem. They're already at the Stone Age. But my question is this: who is funding ISIS? Isn't it oil?
I'm sure a lot of it is oil, yes.
So again, it's money, right? Because it takes a lot of money to fight.
Robert, you started off this segment by saying the U.S. is a communist country now, and I think
no, it's a communist economy. It's controlled by the government.
Well, I think it's interesting because we can bring some good news in here at last.
Good, great idea.
ISIS is going to quit.
The reason that it became like this is because in World War II, which we were attacked and we entered the war, and at that point it was total war. And the government at that point took over complete control over the economy, production, distribution, pricing, and labor. And it's never gone back the way it was before.
Yeah, also in 1943 was a Current Tax Payment Act. Remember that? Where they could tax the American worker.
Right.
So that's a good thing about the war, taxes.
And so if you understand that the government has been controlling the economy one way or the other since then, the good news is that if you can anticipate what the government is going to do next, and that's what I try to do with Macro Watch, is try to understand what they're going to do next, and then you'll know what's going to happen to asset prices. And so that's the good news. If you understand the government's controlling the economy, and if you can anticipate what the government's going to do next, then you should be able to make a lot of money.
Right, and that's why my little Porsche I paid $50,000 for is now on sale for $365,000. Is because tangible assets are going up. That's why artwork is going up, and stuff like that. It's just because they're printing so much money. Is that basically it, Richard?
That's right, and it seems that they're going to have to continue doing that, because if they stop, then this global economic bubble is going to implode into a depression.
So you think
the only choice they have is to print more and keep it inflated.
So there's going to be a QE4?
I think there will be.
Well, that's really good news, especially for guys like us who are debtors. You see, savers are getting creamed, but debtors are winners. So really, that's some of the good news I want people to listen to right now. And that's why I always say to people, when you go to the supermarket and you buy a carton of milk, the first thing you want to check is the expiration date of that milk. It's the same thing with your ideas. If you're still thinking save money and invest for the long term in the stock market, I would subscribe to Macro Watch and maybe rethink, some of the thoughts inside your head. So, Richard, I want to thank you for being a great friend, and keep up the good work, because you teach me the most. And although I disagree, I'm not a communist. I don't want the government taking over anything more, but I think that's what's going to happen, exactly as you say. And then we come back. We'll be going to our favorite part of the program, is Ask Robert, where you get to ask your questions of me.
The Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
Welcome to Capital City from the mind of Robert Kiyosaki, the smash hit resource management game where you buy, sell, and trade your way to victory. Play with up to 5 friends, or take on the evil super-core robots. You can corner the market on coffee shops and rule the Java jungle. Buy fixer-uppers and use elbow grease to make big old piles of cash. Or you can do what I do and buy up all the florists. Why? Because flowers represent beauty and nature, which nourishes my delicate sensibilities. Choose from 11 crazy vehicles. Flow like a cloud in the hovercraft. Crush the competition in the tank. Or drive the bus, because you like buses. This is your Capital City. Shape it how you want. Capital City, now available on the App Store and Google Play. Capital City, it's not just fun, it's stupid fun.
You're listening to the Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. Once again, thank you to a very, very special guest, friend, and economist, Richard Duncan. He's the author of The Dollar Crisis, The New Depression, and The Corruption of Capitalism. You can reach him at richardduncaneconomics.com, richardduncaneconomics.com. And his publication is macrowatch.com. We highly suggest you read it because he sees everything from a world point of view, not just a U.S. point of view, and everything is changing every single day. So now we're at Ask Robert. You can submit your questions to richdadradio.com for Ask Robert. It's the most popular part of our program. So, Melissa, what's the first question?
Our first question today comes from Cash in New York. Cash is his
Good name.
Mm-hmm. Favorite book, Midas Touch. He says, Robert, does the rich dad philosophy work in all economies or just in democratic or open economies? In other words, would rich dad work in Cuba?
That's a great question because there's nothing to do with the external economy. You guys have probably heard me say there's an economy inside of you and an economy outside of you. So a poor person will always see a poor economy, even in the U.S. As you know, the poverty in America is at an all-time high, but it's not because the economy is bad, it's because the poor person's personal economy is bad, the lack of education, bad information. So what's really going great in America is the 10% are getting richer and richer. So the Rich Dad Radio program, Midas Touch is about my friend Donald Trump and I writing that book together. We want you to be rich. That's why our first book is Why We Want You to Be Rich. It has nothing to do with the economy. If I lived in Cuba, I'd be rich. I live in South America, I'd be rich. I live in China, I'd be rich. It has nothing to do with the economy. It has to do with you, your mindset, your skill set.
And that's like, we hear it all the time. Oh, you can do it in the U.S., but you can't do it here. You can't do it here. So I mean, people
you can't do it, but I can.
Yeah, and people are doing it all over. Like there are 2 young women in a small island in Indonesia that I know of who are buying rental properties, and so yeah, they can do it anywhere. It's not a matter.
It's you that is the difference. Your economy, your personal, mental, and physical, and spiritual economy. Next question, Melissa.
Our next question comes from Bailey in Bozeman, Montana. Favorite book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Says, Robert, you've mentioned that you support Americans owning dual passports. Do you do this to help with investing? If so, how does this work?
Well, thanks for the question, but I never said that. And be careful of what you hear versus what I say. I say that there are people who own dual passports as a defense against confiscation in the U.S. Kim and I do not have dual passports, namely because we don't need them. Now, we were in Cancun with our friend Simon Black, and we looked into it. But we don't recommend it, and we don't have dual passports. So please, thank you for the question, but also be careful of what I say and what you hear. Very different things. I do not have a dual passport, but we're looking into it. Not because we're going to do it, but just because I want to expand my point of view outside of America.
I think that's the main point. We're looking into it. We're researching it. We're doing our homework. We're figuring out if it works for us or doesn't work for us. But we're not saying, yeah, we're going to do this just because somebody said to do it.
I'm also looking for Bigfoot in Seattle, but I haven't found
I mean,
him yet.
Bailey's got to do his or her own homework and research and figure it out if it works for them.
And by the way, I love Montana. It's such a great state. Anyway, thank you. Next question, Melissa.
Our next question comes from Christy in Oklahoma. Favorite book, Unfair Advantage. She says, what are your thoughts on the U.S. Treasury saying the debt has been frozen at $18 trillion for 90 days? How is that even possible?
Well, I never heard that, but it is impossible. You see, if you have to understand the difference between cash accounting and accrual accounting. Right now, on cash accounting, you can say, well, we're not going to borrow anymore, but of course they're doing that. When you look at accrual accounting, it's called off-balance sheet debt. The United States has approximately 100 trillion to 250 trillion in debt accruing. I mean, that means every day we get older, more people move on to Social Security and Medicare. You cannot stop that. That's accrual accounting, and the reason the U.S. gets away with it because they keep it off balance sheet. If you and I kept off balance sheet accounting, we'd be in jail. So it's a great question, but if you believe what our politicians are saying, you know, when they're lying, it's when their lips are moving. Next question, Melissa.
Kimberly from Kansas City, favorite book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. If cash will become trash, as you say, what will we do for currency in the new world?
Well, that's up to you. It doesn't make any difference. Again, the first question, if your economy is sound, it doesn't make any difference. You see, what happens if cash becomes trash, like I think it will, that just means prices on real goods and services go up. It's bad news for somebody with a dress shop. If you don't really need a new dress, you're out of business. But if you're selling or producing food, like if you produce tomatoes or cucumbers, you'll do well because inflation will help you. If you have a lot of debt, that means you'll be paying off that debt with lower value dollars as long as you have tenants. And what I mean by are you in the real economy is Kim and I don't flip houses. I think flipping is like stock investing. You're gambling. We're not gamblers. We provide housing at good prices for people who are in what we call the workforce. And so we provide a good product and service at a fair price. And we use debt to finance that. If I'm trying to flip a house, you're going to get screwed doing that if the economy flops you. Any comments?
I guess my main question to Kimberly would be, if cash becomes trash, then what are you doing today to prepare for that possible scenario? We're not saying it's going to happen, but if it does happen, what are you doing today to prepare for it?
It's just happening slowly. The point here, you can buy gold and silver, precious metals. Anybody can buy gold and silver. You don't have to be a rocket science to do that. And you can buy stocks or funds called prudent bear funds or bear market funds that go up when the markets crash. Idiots can do that. Any idiot can save money. Any idiot can invest in a 401k. And those are the people who will get crushed because they're sitting there going, I just hope nothing happens. And the whole economy is based upon idiots doing things without thinking. You don't have to think at all. You don't have to know anything to sign up for a 401k. They do it all for you. They make it easy. You don't have to be very smart to get a credit card, but you be very smart to buy an apartment house with credit. And so the whole thing here is most people are not very smart, and they want the easy road. They want to get easy credit card. They want 401ks, and they just want to save money because it takes no intelligence. Rich Dad is not for those people. Rich Dad's for people like you who want to be more proactive about their future, learn more, and then make their own decisions rather than have some financial planner tell you what to do with your money.
And one final comment I would make is if cash goes to trash, then what do you have of service that would be of value? What product or service that it could be of value that you could trade? That's one way you could be proactive today.
Yeah, you go barter at that time.
Yep.
But debt is a fabulous way of getting rich when cash goes to trash, except most financial experts say get out of debt. What they're talking about is credit card debt, easy debt. They're not talking about smart debt, such as investing in apartment houses or businesses or other real estate. Once again, I want to thank you all. Thank Richard Duncan for his contribution to us, the Rich Dad program. You can submit your questions, again, at richdadradio.com. And I want to thank you all for listening.
And please be aware of where you get your information.